April 19th, 1945. Forward Medical Station, Leyte Island, Philippines. Captain Helen Frazier pressed 2 fingers against the wrist of a young Japanese woman lying motionless on a canvas stretcher. The pulse was rapid, thready, barely perceptible beneath skin that burned with fever. 104 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermometer confirmed what Frazier already knew from years of nursing combat casualties. Without intervention, this woman would be dead by morning. The patient's name was Michiko Tanaka, 23 years old, a civilian nurse conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps in 1943. She had been captured 3 days earlier when American forces overran a field hospital near Ormoc. Now she lay dying, not from battle wounds, but from an infected laceration on her left leg, a wound so minor it should never have killed anyone. The gash, no more than 3 inches long, had turned septic. Red streaks of lymphangitis climbed toward her thigh. Blood poisoning, septicemia. Around Tanaka's stretcher, 11 other Japanese women sat in frightened silence. They were nurses, all of them, captured alongside their dying friend. They had watched her fever climb for 2 days. They had cleaned her wound with boiled water and wrapped it in clean bandages torn from American supplies. Nothing had worked. In their eyes, Captain Frazier could see resignation. They had accepted that Michiko would die, the way soldiers accepted death in war, the way their training had taught them to accept loss without protest. What happened next would shatter everything these women had been taught about their enemy, about American barbarism, about the inevitable fate of prisoners who fell into Western hands. Captain Frazier reached into her medical kit and withdrew a small glass vial filled with yellowish powder, penicillin, the miracle drug that was saving thousands of Allied soldiers from infections that would have killed them in any previous war. She dissolved the powder in sterile water, drew it into a syringe, and administered the first injection into Michiko's arm. The other Japanese nurses leaned forward, watching with expressions that mixed hope and disbelief. One of them, a woman named Keiko Yamamoto who spoke limited English, whispered a question. "Medicine?" "For her?" Frazier nodded. "Yes, for her. We're going to try to save her life." The words seemed impossible to the women who heard them. Everything they had been told, everything drilled into them during training, had emphasized that capture meant death or worse. Japanese military doctrine stated explicitly that prisoners could expect no mercy from Americans. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The propaganda had been relentless. American soldiers, they were told, were devils who tortured prisoners, who violated women, who showed no humanity toward the defeated. Better to die fighting, better to take your own life, than to fall into enemy hands. The military police, the Kempeitai, had reinforced this message with stories of atrocities, with warnings that surrender meant degradation and death. Every Japanese soldier and nurse carried this belief like armor against the temptation to give up. Yet here was an American nurse, administering precious medicine to save a Japanese prisoner's life. The contradiction was profound. Captain Helen Frazier had arrived in the Philippines in January 1945 with the 6th Army's Medical Corps. Born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, she had trained at the Army School of Nursing in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. She had seen action in New Guinea, where jungle diseases killed as many men as Japanese bullets. She had treated Allied soldiers torn apart by shrapnel, burned by flamethrowers, ravaged by malaria and dysentery. She had also treated Japanese prisoners, though they were rare. Most Japanese soldiers chose death over capture. Those who survived to reach American medical stations often refused treatment, expecting execution. Frazier had watched Japanese wounded turn their faces to the wall and wait for death rather than accept help from the enemy. It was a psychological barrier, as impenetrable as any fortification. The penicillin in her medical kit represented a revolution in warfare medicine. Discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, penicillin had remained a laboratory curiosity until 1942, when mass production began in the United States. By 1944, American factories were producing enough penicillin to treat wounded soldiers across multiple theaters of war. The drug transformed battlefield medicine. Infections that had killed soldiers in World War I, gangrene, septicemia, pneumonia, could now be stopped with a series of injections. The survival rate for wounded soldiers increased dramatically. Men who would have died in previous wars now lived to fight again or return home. For the Allied Medical Corps, penicillin was the single most important advancement of the war, more valuable than any weapon. But penicillin was scarce. Production had increased, but demand remained enormous. Every vial was allocated carefully, reserved for Allied wounded. Using penicillin on enemy prisoners was not standard protocol. Some medical officers argued it was wasteful, even immoral, to give critical supplies to enemy combatants when Allied soldiers might need them. Yet Captain Frazier, like many American medical personnel, followed a different principle. The Hippocratic Oath made no distinction between ally and enemy. A patient was a patient. A life was a life. When Michiko Tanaka arrived at the medical station with clear signs of septicemia, Frazier made her decision without hesitation. She would treat the infection with the same aggressive approach she used for American soldiers. Penicillin, administered every 4 hours, combined with intravenous fluids and careful wound management. If the drug worked, Tanaka would live. If it failed, at least they would have tried. The first 24 hours were critical. Frazier monitored Tanaka's vital signs constantly: temperature, pulse, respiration, the indicators of whether the infection was retreating or advancing. The other Japanese nurses remained nearby, sleeping on the ground beside their friend's stretcher, refusing to leave despite offers of more comfortable quarters. They watched every injection, every temperature check, every adjustment of the intravenous line. Keiko Yamamoto, the English speaker, asked questions. What was the medicine? How did it work? Would Michiko survive? Frazier answered honestly. The medicine was called penicillin. It killed the bacteria causing the infection. Whether Michiko survived depended on how quickly the drug could stop the spread of poison in her blood. By the morning of April 20th, 36 hours after the first injection, Michiko's fever had dropped to 101 degrees. The red streaks on her leg had stopped advancing. Her pulse was stronger, more regular. She opened her eyes and spoke weakly in Japanese. The other nurses crowded around her stretcher, tears streaming down their faces. They touched her hands, stroked her hair, spoke rapidly in words Captain Frazier couldn't understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. Relief. Joy. Keiko Yamamoto turned to Frazier, her face wet with tears. She bowed deeply, the formal bow of profound respect, and spoke in halting English. Thank you. We thought she would die. We thought you would let her die. You saved her. Why? The question hung in the air. Why would an American nurse use precious medicine to save an enemy prisoner? Why show mercy to people who had been trained to expect none? Frazier's answer was simple, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. Because she's a patient, because she's a human being, because it's what we do. The words seemed to stagger the Japanese women. They looked at each other, then back at Frazier, then at Michiko lying on the stretcher with colour returning to her cheeks. Something fundamental had broken in that moment. A belief system, carefully constructed through years of propaganda and military indoctrination, had collided with an undeniable reality. The enemy was not what they had been told. The Americans were not the monsters of official narrative. Over the following days, as Michiko's condition continued to improve, the psychological transformation among the Japanese nurses became more apparent. They began speaking more freely with the American medical staff. They asked about medical techniques, about supplies, about the organization of American field hospitals. What they discovered shocked them. American medical stations were supplied with equipment and medicines that Japanese field hospitals could only dream of. Sulfur drugs, plasma for transfusions, surgical instruments, anesthetics, all available in quantities that seemed impossible. The contrast was stark. Japanese military medicine had become increasingly primitive as the war progressed. Supplies were scarce. Medicines were rationed to the point of uselessness. Wounded soldiers often received minimal care because there was nothing available to treat them with. The Japanese nurses had learned to make do with inadequate resources, to watch men die from treatable conditions, to accept loss as inevitable. They had been told this was because Japan's resources were directed toward winning the war, toward final victory that would justify all sacrifices. But seeing American abundance, understanding that the enemy had so much that they could spare advanced medicine for prisoners, forced a reckoning. If America could afford to treat enemy wounded with miracle drugs, what did that say about Japan's chances of winning? What did it say about the propaganda that promised victory despite hardship? The psychological impact extended beyond medical supplies. The Japanese nurses observed how American medical personnel treated patients. There was no brutality, no casual cruelty, no contempt for the wounded. American doctors and nurses worked with the same careful attention to detail whether treating an American soldier or a Japanese prisoner. When supplies allowed, Japanese wounded received the same level of care as Allied wounded. This was not propaganda. This was not performance for observers. This was simply how American military medicine operated. The principle of treating all patients equally, regardless of nationality, was embedded in American military medical training. It was codified in regulations, emphasized in instruction, and practiced consistently. Captain Frazier and her colleagues were not exceptional in their treatment of Michiko Tanaka. They were following standard American military medical protocol. But to the Japanese nurses, who had been trained in a system where resources were scarce and enemy lives were worthless, this approach seemed revolutionary. It challenged everything they understood about warfare, about national loyalty, about the nature of the enemy they were fighting. By April 25th, 6 days after receiving her first penicillin injection, Michiko Tanaka was sitting up, eating solid food, and speaking in full sentences. The infection had been completely eradicated. The wound on her leg was healing cleanly. She would recover fully, would survive the war, would return eventually to Japan, and live a long life. All because an American nurse had decided to use a few vials of penicillin to save an enemy prisoner's life. The story of what happened spread through the prisoner of war camp where the Japanese nurses were held. Other prisoners heard about the American medicine that had saved Michiko's life. They heard about the American nurses who had treated her with respect and care. The psychological impact rippled outward, challenging the fortress of propaganda that had convinced Japanese soldiers and civilians that surrender meant torture and death. Some prisoners remained skeptical, believing the story was Allied propaganda designed to encourage surrender. But those who saw Michiko, who spoke with the nurses who had witnessed her treatment, could not deny the evidence. The Americans had the capacity to kill. They had the military power to annihilate prisoners without consequence. Yet they chose to heal instead. The context of what happened at that Leyte medical station in April 1945 requires understanding the brutal mathematics of Japanese military medicine. By the spring of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army's medical system had collapsed under the weight of attrition, dwindling resources, and strategic isolation. What had once been a functional, if Spartan, medical infrastructure had deteriorated into something barely recognizable as organized healthcare. In 1941, when Japan's military expansion was at its peak, Japanese field hospitals operated with reasonable efficiency. They had access to imported medicines, trained surgeons, and supply lines that, while never as robust as American logistics, were adequate for treating wounded soldiers. Japanese military doctors had studied Western medicine, understood modern surgical techniques, and applied them competently within the constraints of available resources. But by 1943, those supply lines had begun to fracture. American submarines were strangling Japanese merchant shipping. Medicines that had been imported from Europe or synthesized in Japanese factories became increasingly scarce. Sulfur drugs, morphine, anesthetics, all became precious commodities rationed so severely that many wounded soldiers received no pain relief at all. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia, holding down screaming patients while cutting through flesh and bone. The statistics were grim. In 1944, the Japanese army estimated that 60% of combat deaths resulted not from immediate battle wounds, but from infections and disease that could have been treated with adequate medical supplies. Soldiers died from infected wounds that would have been survivable with antibiotics. They died from malaria that could have been controlled with quinine. They died from dysentery, from gangrene, from septicemia, from preventable conditions that turned fatal because there was nothing available to treat them with. Japanese military nurses, like Michiko Tanaka and her colleagues, were trained to function in this environment of scarcity. Their instruction emphasized improvisation, making do with minimal resources, accepting that many patients would die simply because there was no medicine to save them. They learned to use boiled water and clean bandages as their primary tools. They learned to comfort dying men because comfort was often all they could offer. They learned to suppress their emotions, to view death as inevitable rather than tragic. This was not callousness, it was survival. A nurse who grieved for every patient she lost would break under the psychological weight. The military training deliberately hardened them, teaching them to accept loss without question, to continue functioning despite constant exposure to suffering and death. It was a brutal but necessary adaptation to circumstances where resources could not match need. The propaganda that accompanied this medical scarcity was carefully constructed. Japanese soldiers and medical personnel were told that hardship was noble, that suffering demonstrated dedication to the emperor and the nation. They were taught that Western dependence on technology and abundant supplies represented weakness, a lack of spiritual strength. Japan would prevail, the narrative insisted, through superior willpower and dedication, through acceptance of sacrifice that soft Western nations could never match. The medical system's failures were reframed as proof of character rather than evidence of strategic collapse. When wounded soldiers died from lack of medicine, it was presented as honorable sacrifice rather than preventable tragedy. When nurses worked without adequate supplies, they were praised for their devotion rather than pitied for being placed in impossible situations. The propaganda created a psychological fortress that protected military personnel from recognizing the full extent of their disadvantage. This fortress made what Captain Frazier did even more devastating to the Japanese nurses who witnessed it. The abundance of American medical supplies, the casual use of advanced medicine to save an enemy prisoner's life, the efficient organization of the field hospital, all of it directly contradicted everything they had been taught. If America had so much that they could waste it on prisoners, what did that say about Japan's claim of superior spirit overcoming material disadvantage? If American nurses could afford to be merciful, what did that say about the necessity of Japanese hardship? The cognitive dissonance was profound. April 27, 1945, the prisoner of war camp, Leyte. Major Robert Chen of the Military Intelligence Service conducted his first formal interview with the Japanese nurses. Chen, a Nisei officer born in California to Japanese immigrant parents, spoke fluent Japanese and had conducted hundreds of prisoner interrogations throughout the Pacific Campaign. He had learned to recognize the psychological patterns, the stages prisoners went through as their indoctrination confronted reality. What he observed with the nurses captured at Ormoc was different. These were not soldiers hardened by combat, not fanatics who maintained their beliefs against all evidence. These were medical professionals whose entire worldview had been shattered by a single act of mercy. Keiko Yamamoto spoke for the group, her words translated by Chen for the official record. We were taught that Americans were barbaric, that they had no honor, that they treated prisoners with cruelty and contempt. We were told that if captured, we should expect torture or death. Every training session emphasized this. Every propaganda film we watched showed American soldiers as monsters. When we were captured, we expected the worst. When Michiko became sick, we thought we would have to watch her die. We had no medicine. We assumed the Americans would give us none. She paused, searching for words to describe what happened next. Then Captain Frazier treated her. She used medicine, valuable medicine, to save Michiko's life. She checked on her constantly, like Michiko was her own patient, like she mattered. We could not understand it. Why would the enemy save one of us? We asked ourselves if it was a trick, if they were saving her so they could use her for propaganda or interrogation, but no one asked Michiko questions about military information. No one demanded anything in return for the treatment. They just saved her life because she was sick. The impact of this realization was evident in Yamamoto's voice, recorded in Chen's report. Everything we were told was a lie. The Americans are not monsters. They have honor. They have mercy. They treated us better than our own military treated us. We had nurses in our unit who died from infections because we had no medicine. The army told us there was no choice, that we had to accept these deaths. But the Americans had medicine. They had so much medicine they could give it to us, their enemies. How can we believe anything we were told when this one thing, this most important thing, was completely false? Major Chen's report to intelligence headquarters emphasized the propaganda value of this incident. The psychological impact of medical treatment on Japanese prisoners cannot be overstated. These individuals have experienced a fundamental collapse of their belief system. They are now questioning not just specific military claims, but the entire narrative structure of Japanese propaganda. Recommendation: where medical supplies allow, continue treating Japanese prisoners with the same standard of care provided to Allied wounded. The intelligence and propaganda benefits justify the resource expenditure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The recommendation was not purely cynical. American military medical personnel genuinely believed in treating all patients according to medical need rather than nationality, but intelligence officers recognized that this principle had strategic benefits. Every Japanese prisoner who received competent medical care became a potential source of accurate information about American treatment of prisoners. Every story of American mercy that filtered back to Japanese lines weakened the propaganda that convinced soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender. The mathematics were brutal but clear. A Japanese soldier who believed surrender meant torture would fight until killed, inflicting maximum Allied casualties. A Japanese soldier who believed surrender might mean survival and humane treatment might choose to give up, reducing Allied casualties while removing an enemy combatant from the battlefield. Medical treatment of prisoners was not just humanitarian principle but strategic calculation, though the two motives were not mutually exclusive. The broader pattern of American medical treatment of Japanese prisoners was documented extensively throughout the Pacific Campaign. At the prisoner of war camp on Guam, American doctors treated Japanese wounded with the same aggressive approach used for Allied casualties. Surgeons performed complex operations to save limbs that Japanese military doctors would have simply amputated. Patients received pain medication, proper nutrition, and physical therapy during recovery. The survival rate for Japanese wounded in American care was significantly higher than for similar wounds treated in Japanese field hospitals. On Okinawa, where fighting was particularly brutal and casualties were enormous, American medical personnel established a separate facility for treating Japanese prisoners. The facility was staffed with doctors and nurses who could have been assigned to Allied hospitals, but were instead dedicated to enemy wounded. When supplies were strained, as they frequently were during heavy fighting, the allocation system prioritized based on medical need rather than nationality. A Japanese prisoner with a life-threatening wound received treatment before an Allied soldier with a minor injury. This approach was not universal among American personnel. Some officers and enlisted men resented resources being devoted to enemy prisoners. Some argued that every bullet, every bandage, every vial of medicine used on a Japanese prisoner was one less available for Allied soldiers. The tension between humanitarian principle and resource allocation was real and ongoing. But military medical regulations were clear. Prisoners were to be treated according to the Geneva Convention standards, which required proper medical care. American military culture, shaped by civilian values and legal traditions, generally enforced these standards, even when they conflicted with immediate tactical interests. The contrast with Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was stark and well documented. Allied prisoners of war in Japanese custody faced systematic neglect and abuse. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Wounded prisoners were left to die from infections, from malaria, from malnutrition. Japanese military doctrine held that soldiers who surrendered had forfeited their right to honorable treatment. Prison camps operated with minimal resources, and what resources existed were reserved for Japanese personnel. The death rate among Allied prisoners in Japanese custody was approximately 27%, compared to less than 4% for Axis prisoners in Allied custody. This was not merely the result of resource scarcity. It reflected fundamental differences in how the two sides viewed prisoners and warfare itself. The Japanese military operated on principles derived from Bushido, the warrior code that emphasized death before dishonor. Surrender was seen as the ultimate dishonor, proof of moral weakness. Prisoners, whether Japanese soldiers who had been captured or enemy prisoners in Japanese custody, were viewed with contempt. They had failed the fundamental test of warrior spirit. This philosophical framework made the concept of humane treatment for prisoners nearly incomprehensible within Japanese military culture. When Japanese nurses like Michiko Tanaka and her colleagues encountered American medical treatment that contradicted everything they had been taught, the psychological impact was devastating in the truest sense. It devastated their existing belief structure, forced them to rebuild their understanding of the war, of their enemy, of the validity of their own nation's claims. Some prisoners couldn't make this adjustment. They rejected the evidence before their eyes, insisting that American kindness was manipulation, that mercy was a trick designed to extract information or create propaganda. But medical treatment was difficult to dismiss as manipulation. When a nurse used precious medicine to save your friend's life, when a doctor spent hours in surgery to repair damage that could have been ignored, when the care was consistent and ongoing rather than performative, the evidence became undeniable. The Americans were different. The propaganda had been lies. By May 1945, Michiko Tanaka had recovered sufficiently to be transferred to the main prisoner of war facility on Leyte. She walked out of the medical station under her own power, her infected leg completely healed, her life saved by medicine that shouldn't have been wasted on an enemy prisoner according to the logic she had been raised with. The other Japanese nurses accompanied her, 11 women whose understanding of the world had been fundamentally altered by watching their friend receive competent medical care from the enemy they had been taught to hate and fear. Captain Helen Frazier never learned what became of Michiko Tanaka after the war. The chaos of Japan's surrender, the massive repatriation efforts, the destruction of records, all made it impossible to track individual prisoners once they returned home. Frazier continued her medical service through the end of the war, treating wounded soldiers in the Philippines and later in the occupation of Japan itself. She returned to Iowa in 1946, resumed her civilian nursing career, and rarely spoke publicly about her wartime service. But in 1978, 33 years after the incident, Frazier received a letter. It had been forwarded through military archives, through veterans organizations, through a chain of connections that took months to complete. The letter was from Japan, written in careful English by a woman named Keiko Yamamoto. Yamamoto explained that she had been searching for years, trying to find the American nurse who had saved Michiko Tanaka's life. She had contacted veterans groups, written to military hospitals, followed every lead until she finally located Captain Helen Frazier, now retired and living in Cedar Rapids. The letter described what had happened after the war. Michiko Tanaka had returned to Japan in late 1945, one of thousands of repatriated prisoners who filtered back into a nation devastated by defeat. She had resumed nursing, working in civilian hospitals in Tokyo, treating patients in the ruins of a shattered country. She had married, raised children, lived a full life that would have ended at 23 years old on a stretcher in the Philippines, if not for American penicillin. Yamamoto wrote, "Michiko passed away in 1976. Before she died, she asked me to find you if I could. She wanted you to know that she never forgot what you did. She told her children about the American nurse who saved her life when she should have been left to die. She told them that the war taught her that human kindness can exist even between enemies, that mercy is stronger than hatred." The letter continued. "All of us who were there, All of us who watched you treat Michiko, we carried that memory through the rest of our lives. When we returned to Japan and saw the devastation, when we learned how completely we had been lied to about the war, we understood that what you did was not unusual for Americans. You treated prisoners with humanity because that is who you are. We were told you were monsters. You showed us that the monsters were the lies we had been taught to believe. Frazier kept the letter until her death in 1994. It was found among her personal effects, carefully preserved in a folder with her military discharge papers and commendations. Her family donated it to the National World War II Museum, where it remains in the archives, a testament to a moment when medicine transcended warfare, when professional duty proved stronger than national hatred. The broader significance of incidents like Michiko Tanaka's treatment extended beyond individual lives saved. American medical treatment of Japanese prisoners contributed to the gradual erosion of Japanese military morale in the final months of the war. As more prisoners survived to tell stories of humane treatment, as more evidence accumulated that surrender did not mean torture or death, the psychological barriers that kept Japanese soldiers fighting to the last man began to crack. The number of Japanese soldiers surrendering increased steadily through 1945. In the final months of the war, entire units began giving up rather than fighting to annihilation. This was partly due to hopeless tactical situations, but it was also enabled by changing perceptions about what capture meant. Leaflets dropped by American aircraft included testimonials from Japanese prisoners describing their treatment, including medical care they received. Some Japanese soldiers dismissed these as propaganda, but others, facing certain death if they continued fighting, chose to risk surrender based on the possibility that the testimonials were true. The impact carried forward into the post-war occupation. When American forces occupied Japan in August 1945, they encountered a population that had been taught to expect brutal treatment from the conquerors. Many Japanese civilians fled from advancing American troops, believing they would be killed or enslaved. But the occupation proceeded with remarkable restraint. American military government provided food aid, medical care, and economic assistance to the devastated Japanese population. The contrast between expected barbarism and actual behavior was so stark that it fundamentally reshaped Japanese attitudes toward America. Within years, Japan transformed from bitter enemy to close ally, a shift enabled partly by the accumulated evidence that American actions contradicted Japanese wartime propaganda. Medical treatment had been part of that evidence. Every Japanese prisoner who survived because of American medicine, every family that received a loved one back who should have died, contributed to the psychological foundation for post-war reconciliation. The story of Michiko Tanaka and the American penicillin that saved her life became one small thread in that larger tapestry of transformation. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, the American Medical Association published a retrospective analysis of military medicine in World War II. The section on treatment of enemy wounded included statistics that told the story in numbers. American military medical facilities in the Pacific Theater had treated approximately 43,000 Japanese prisoners during the war. The survival rate for Japanese wounded in American care was 79%, compared to an estimated 43% survival rate for similar wounds treated in Japanese military hospitals. The difference was attributed to 3 factors: abundant medical supplies, particularly antibiotics like penicillin, well-trained medical personnel, and consistent application of treatment protocols without regard to patient nationality. The report concluded that medical treatment of enemy wounded had been justified both on humanitarian grounds and strategic calculation. The cost in resources had been minimal compared to the intelligence gathered from cooperative prisoners and the propaganda benefits of documented humane treatment. But the report also emphasized that medical personnel had not treated enemy wounded primarily for strategic reasons. They had done so because it was the right thing to do, because their professional ethics demanded it, because American values insisted that even enemies deserved humane treatment when they were helpless and wounded. This principle, the report suggested, was itself a strategic advantage. It meant that American military personnel operated with moral clarity, without the psychological burden of systematic cruelty. It meant that the American way of war, despite its industrial scale and terrible efficiency, retained connection to humanitarian principles that distinguished it from totalitarian approaches to warfare. Today, the principles Captain Helen Frazier followed in April 1945 remain embedded in American military medical doctrine. The treatment of prisoners according to medical need rather than nationality is codified in regulations, emphasized in training, and generally enforced in practice. Modern military medicine has advanced far beyond penicillin and canvas stretchers, but the ethical framework remains constant. A patient is a patient, a life is a life. The duty to heal transcends the circumstance of warfare. In the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Spring, Maryland, a small exhibit displays a vial of penicillin from World War II. The placard explains how this antibiotic revolutionized battlefield medicine, saving countless lives that would have been lost in previous wars. But the exhibit doesn't mention Michiko Tanaka, doesn't tell the story of Japanese nurses who wept with joy when their friend survived because an American captain used precious medicine to save an enemy prisoner. That story exists in archives, in letters, in the memories of those who witnessed it and carried it forward. It exists as one example among thousands of moments when medical professionals chose to honor their calling despite the hatreds of warfare, when human decency proved stronger than propaganda, when mercy demonstrated that even in the depths of total war, some principles remained inviolate. The morning Michiko Tanaka walked out of that medical station on Leyte, her life saved by medicine and mercy, represented more than one woman's survival. It represented the collision of two philosophies of warfare. One philosophy held that enemies were subhuman, that prisoners had forfeited any claim to consideration, that resources should never be wasted on those who had already lost. The other philosophy held that even enemies remained human, that medical ethics transcended national loyalty, that showing mercy to the helpless was strength rather than weakness. The contrast between these philosophies shaped not just battlefield medicine, but the entire character of how America fought World War II. The industrial power, the massive logistics, the overwhelming material advantage, all of these were important. But equally important was the insistence on maintaining humanitarian principles, even within the machinery of total war. The decision to use penicillin on a dying Japanese prisoner was a small decision, made by one captain in one field hospital on one day in April 1945. But it was connected to larger patterns, to a way of thinking about warfare that rejected the totalitarian insistence that victory justified any action, any cruelty, any abandonment of moral constraint. When Japanese nurses watched their friend survive because the enemy chose to save her, they witnessed the practical application of principles they had been taught did not exist. The cognitive dissonance forced them to question everything. If the Americans showed mercy when they could have shown none, what else had they been lied to about? If the enemy had abundant resources while Japan starved, what did that say about which side was truly winning? If medical professionals on both sides took the same oath but only one side honored it consistently, who represented civilization and who represented barbarism? These questions had no comfortable answers for women raised in a system that demanded absolute loyalty, that punished doubt, that insisted on faith in ultimate victory despite all evidence. But the questions, once raised, could not be unasked. The evidence, once seen, could not be unseen. A friend dying was a friend saved. Medicine wasted on an enemy was a life given back. The story ends where it began, with young women facing death in war. But unlike the countless deaths that warfare makes inevitable, this one was prevented. A Japanese nurse who should have died on a stretcher in the Philippines lived instead, returned home, raised a family, and told her children about mercy shown by an enemy who was supposed to be merciless. 11 other nurses carried that memory for the rest of their lives, a memory that challenged everything they had been taught, that forced them to recognize the humanity of those they had been trained to hate. Captain Helen Frazier, who made the decision to use penicillin on Michiko Tanaka, was following protocols, doing her job, applying her training. She was not trying to make a political statement or challenge propaganda. She was simply being a nurse, treating a patient who needed treatment. That this simple professional act became revolutionary says everything about the gulf between American and Japanese military culture, about the contrast between systems that valued individual human life and systems that viewed individuals as expendable resources in service to the state. The penicillin used to save Michiko Tanaka's life cost approximately $3. The strategic value of that expenditure, measured in propaganda impact and intelligence benefits, was incalculable, but the human value, measured in one life saved and 11 others transformed, transcended any calculation of strategic advantage. It was an act of mercy that rippled forward through decades, through families, through the memories of those who witnessed it and understood that even in war, humanity could prevail over hatred. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.